Number police chief threatened black activist froze when Attorney General's letter hit his desk. "You want to keep living in this town," Chief Dale Hargrove said. "You learn to stay in your lane." He said it quietly. That was the thing people remembered afterward, not that he said it loudly, not that he made a scene. He said it the way you say something when you are so certain of the ground beneath your feet that you don't need volume to make the earth shake. He was standing in the doorway of the Calvary Street Community Center, blocking it with his body the way a door blocks a doorframe, not dramatically, just functionally. Just there. Marcus Webb didn't move. He was 54 years old, and he was standing on the sidewalk in front of the building he had been renting for 9 years, in the town where he had lived for 26, holding a manila folder against his chest, the way you hold something you don't want bent. He looked at Chief Hargrove the way still water looks, which is to say, you could see everything reflected in it and nothing disturbed. The 3 officers behind the chief didn't look at Marcus. They looked at the middle distance, the kind of looking that means, I am here, but I am not here. People on Calvary Street were watching. 17, maybe 20 people, outside the barber shop and the dollar store and the dry cleaner with the hand-painted sign, watching, quiet. Hargrove didn't know what was in that folder. In 72 hours, everyone would. Have you ever stood your ground in front of someone who had every official instrument of power behind them and held something in your hands that they couldn't see? Stay with me, because this story starts much earlier than this doorway, and the ending was written long before Dale Hargrove said a single word. Let me take you back, 3 days before this morning. Before the folder, before the doorway, before the officers who couldn't find anywhere to look. The town of Caldwell, Georgia, had a population of 22,000 people and 1 traffic light that took 4 minutes to cycle on a good day. It sat in the middle of a county that had been, at various points in its history, a cotton county, a timber county, and briefly and unsuccessfully a tourist county, before settling into the slow, specific economic condition that looks from the outside like stagnation and feels from the inside like survival. 43% of Caldwell's population was black. 43%. The police department had 11 officers, and the composition of those 11 officers was a number Marcus Webb had been saying out loud at city council meetings for 6 years. He had a way of saying numbers that made them sound like what they were. Not statistics, not talking points, but facts with weight and edges. He would say the number slowly, let it sit in the air of whatever room he was in, and then say, that's a fact, not an opinion, a fact. What do you want to do about it? He had been saying it since 2018. The number had not changed. Marcus had come to Caldwell in 1998 with a philosophy degree from Spelman College's brother school, Clark Atlanta, a marriage that had lasted 4 years longer than it should have, and a conviction that had been with him since he was 12 years old, sitting in the back of his grandfather's church in Albany, listening to a man read Amos from the pulpit, not Matthew, not John, but Amos, the herdsman prophet, the one who had no business preaching but opened his mouth anyway because the injustice was too loud to ignore. Marcus had felt something settle in his chest that morning, a specific gravity, and it had not moved since. He taught high school history at Caldwell Preparatory for 11 years. He coached debate. He started a Saturday morning literacy program in the basement of First Baptist that ran for 6 years before First Baptist needed the basement for something else, at which point Marcus found the community center on Calvary Street and signed a lease on a Saturday afternoon in November, with $43 in his checking account and a character reference from his landlord. The Calvary Street Community Center was not impressive to look at. It was a converted storefront, 1,200 square feet, with linoleum tile in 2 different patterns, because the renovation had run out of one kind and had to switch. There were folding tables and mismatched chairs and a kitchen in the back that functioned at about 70% capacity, which was fine because the people who used it were accustomed to making 70% work like 100. On the wall behind the front desk, Marcus had hung a framed print of Frederick Douglass, not the famous portrait, the later one, but an earlier daguerreotype from 1847. When Douglass was young, and his eyes had a particular quality that Marcus described to people who asked as, he already knows what he's going to do. The center offered after-school tutoring, voter registration drives, legal aid referrals, and a monthly meeting Marcus called the Forum, which was open to anyone and which operated on a simple principle. You come in, you say what you know, you listen to what you don't, you leave with more than you came with. He had been running the Forum for 7 years. Attendance ranged from 12 people to, on one memorable night, when a proposed rezoning would have displaced 300 families, 240. He had chairs for 80. He kept everything in files. This was the thing that people who underestimated Marcus Webb always missed. They saw the folding tables and the mismatched chairs and the literacy program and the Saturday mornings, and they thought, community organizer. They thought, activist. They thought, someone who makes noise. They did not see the files. Marcus kept records the way some people keep faith, not because they expected to need them immediately, but because the act of keeping them was itself a form of testimony. He had files on every city council vote, going back to 2003. He had files on every zoning decision, every police department budget allocation, every contract awarded in Caldwell's history back to 1987, which was as far back as the public record went, in digitized form. He had files on complaints filed with the police department internally, through the city, through the state oversight board, and on what had happened to those complaints once they were filed. He had been building something for 6 years that he had not yet shown anyone. In his inside coat pocket, for the past 12 days, he had carried a card. Not a business card, a personal card, ivory stock, engraved, with a name and a number in a simple serif font. He had not called the number yet. He had received the card at a conference in Atlanta, from a woman who had shaken his hand for longer than handshakes usually last, who had looked at him with the focused attention of someone who has heard a great deal about you and is confirming what she was told, and who had said, before she moved on to the next person, when you're ready. He was almost ready. He had one more document to file. That was what was in the manila folder. Chief Dale Hargrove had been Caldwell's chief of police for 14 years. Before that, he had been a lieutenant. Before that, a patrol officer. He had grown up 7 miles from Caldwell in a town that didn't exist anymore, swallowed by a county road expansion in the 90s, and he had come back to the area the way people come back to places that formed them, not out of nostalgia but out of gravity. He was not stupid. That was important to understand. People who did what Hargrove did were sometimes assumed to be operating from stupidity, from a failure to foresee consequences. Hargrove was not failing to foresee. He simply did not believe the consequences would arrive. He had been doing what he did for 14 years, and consequences had not arrived. This is a particular kind of confidence. It is earned the wrong way, and it is very difficult to reason with. His department had a use of force incident rate that was 4 times the state average. It had a complaint investigation closure rate of 12%, meaning that of every 100 complaints filed against Caldwell officers, 12 were investigated to any conclusion at all. The rest were closed administratively, a phrase that in practice meant filed and forgotten. His department had, in 14 years, never disciplined an officer for a use of force incident. Not once. Hargrove sat on the board of the Caldwell Business Association. He was a deacon at a church whose congregation was 97% white, in a town that was 43% black. He golfed on Thursdays. He drove a truck that was 3 model years newer than his salary would explain, which was not a secret in Caldwell. It was simply one of those facts that existed in the town, the way certain smells exist in old buildings. Everyone knew it was there, and no one said anything, because saying something required believing that saying something would do anything. Marcus Webb had been saying something for 6 years. What changed 3 weeks before the doorway on Calvary Street was that someone in the state capitol had started listening. The woman's name was Daphne Okafor. She was the Deputy Attorney General of the state of Georgia, and she had been in that position for 3 years, and she had been in civil rights law for 22 years before that. And she had learned in those 22 years that the cases that looked unsolvable from the outside were almost never unsolvable. They were just underdocumented. The story was usually there. The pattern was usually there. What was missing was the paper, the sustained, organized, legally legible record that could walk into a federal courtroom and speak without being interrupted. She had received Marcus Webb's first letter 14 months earlier. It was 11 pages long, single-spaced, with 47 attachments. She had read it on a Sunday afternoon. She had called her deputy the following Monday morning and said 4 words: "I need a team." She had been building the case for 14 months. Marcus did not know the full scope of what she had assembled. He knew she was working. He had provided what she asked for and then some. The files, all of them, scanned and indexed and organized with a precision that had made Daphne Okafor's paralegal, a young woman from Macon who had processed a great many document productions in her career, pause and say to her supervisor, "Who taught this man to keep records?" No one had taught him. His grandfather had, not explicitly, not in the way you teach a subject, in the way you teach a way of being. Marcus's grandfather had kept a journal for 51 years, every day, a spiral notebook he bought at the drugstore, and when he died, he had left 41 of them in a cedar chest in his bedroom closet. Marcus had read every one of them. He had learned from those notebooks that bearing witness was not passive, that attention was not neutral, that the most radical thing a person could do, in a world designed to make certain things invisible, was to see them clearly and write them down. He had been writing things down for a long time. The document in the manila folder was a supplemental filing additional use of force incident reports he had obtained through a public records request 3 weeks earlier, 18 pages, cross-referenced with department budget allocations and officer scheduling records that showed a pattern of overtime clustering around the 2 precincts that bordered the Calvary Street neighborhood. It was the last piece. Daphne Okafor had asked for it by the end of the month. Marcus was going to scan it and send it that morning, and that was when Chief Hargrove's cruiser had pulled up in front of the Calvary Street Community Center. Hargrove had gotten a tip. This was later confirmed. Though the source of the tip was never officially identified, there are certain things that leak from state office buildings the way heat leaks from old pipes, slowly and without a single identifiable origin point, just warmth where there shouldn't be any. What he had been told, imprecisely but accurately enough to alarm him, was that someone at the state level was paying attention to Caldwell. He had driven to Calvary Street because he wanted Marcus Webb to understand something. He had brought 3 officers because understanding sometimes benefits from context. He stood in the doorway. He said what he said. He said it quietly, and Marcus Webb looked at him. "Chief Hargrove," Marcus said. "Good morning." "Morning," Hargrove said. The word in his mouth sounded like a door being pulled shut. "I'm going inside," Marcus said. "I have work to do." Hargrove didn't move. "Like I said," Hargrove said. "Lane." Marcus looked at the 3 officers behind him. He looked at the people on Calvary Street, the 17, maybe 20, who had stopped what they were doing. He looked at the dollar store, and the barber shop, and the dry cleaner, with the hand-painted sign. He had lived in this town for 26 years. He had taught in it, organized in it, filed public records requests in it, attended 1,200 city council meetings in it, and carried 41 spiral notebooks worth of someone else's testimony in his chest, like ballast. He had stood in front of difficult things before. He would stand in front of them again. He said, "I'm going inside, Chief." He walked forward, not running, not pushing, just walking, the way a person walks when they have somewhere to be and intend to be there. Hargrove stepped aside, just barely, just enough. Marcus went inside. But here's what Chief Hargrove did not know, what none of those 3 officers, standing in the morning light on Calvary Street, knew. What the people at the dollar store and the barber shop could not have known either. The manila folder Marcus was carrying was already redundant, because 48 hours earlier, Daphne Okafor had stopped waiting for it. Remember the card in Marcus Webb's inside coat pocket ivory stock, engraved, a name and a number in simple serif font. He had been carrying it for 12 days. Daphne Okafor had given it to him at a conference in Atlanta and said, "When you're ready." He had not called the number yet. On the night before Chief Hargrove stood in the doorway on Calvary Street, Marcus had called the number. He had sat at the desk in his back office at the community center, the desk with the files stacked in their careful order, the Douglas daguerreotype on the wall visible from where he sat, and he had dialed. It was 11:40 in the evening. Daphne Okafor answered on the second ring. "I'm ready," Marcus said. There was a pause on the line that was not hesitation. It was the pause of someone shifting from one mode of attention to another, from the attention of waiting to the attention of acting. "Good," she said, "because we were going to move with or without the supplement." She told him what she had. It took 40 minutes. Marcus didn't speak. during most of it. He sat with the phone against his ear and listened to 14 months of work assembled from his files and from federal records and from sworn statements taken from 17 current and former Caldwell residents. And he listened to the shape of what had been built, which was enormous, which was, and he had known this was possible, had hoped for it, had worked toward it for 6 years, which was enough. What happens next? He said. Tomorrow morning, she said. A letter goes to Chief Dale Hargrove's desk. Certified mail, hand-delivered by a U.S. Marshal. Simultaneously, the State Oversight Board receives a formal notification. The city manager of Caldwell receives a copy. The governor's office receives a copy. The U.S. Department of Justice Community Relations Service receives a courtesy notification. And a press release goes out at 10 o'clock. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What does the letter say?" he said. "It says," Daphne said, and he could hear in her voice the specific satisfaction of someone who has been patient for a very long time, "that the Attorney General of the state of Georgia is opening a formal civil rights investigation into the Caldwell Police Department, its use of force practices, its complaint investigation procedures, and its leadership, and that all records pertaining to department operations for the past 14 years are to be preserved and made available." Marcus sat very still. 14 years, he said. "All of them," she said. He looked at the daguerreotype of Frederick Douglass on the wall, the young man who already knew what he was going to do. "Thank you," Marcus said. "Don't thank me," Daphne said. "You built this." "I just had the letterhead." He had smiled then, alone in the back office, at 11:50 at night, with the files stacked around him and the linoleum tile in 2 different patterns outside the door, and the folding tables and the mismatched chairs that had held 240 people on a night when it mattered. And the next morning, Chief Hargrove had come to tell him to stay in his lane. He had arrived 40 minutes before the letter did. The U.S. Marshal's name was Calvin Reeves. He was 47 years old. He drove a dark blue government sedan, and he arrived at the Caldwell Police Department at 10:17 in the morning, which was 43 minutes after Chief Hargrove had returned from Calvary Street, settled back into his office, poured a second cup of coffee, and told himself that the morning had gone fine. Calvin Reeves walked through the front doors of the Caldwell Police Department. He presented his credentials to the desk officer. He asked for Chief Hargrove. He was told the chief was in his office. He walked to the chief's office. He knocked on the door frame. Hargrove looked up. Calvin Reeves set an envelope on the desk. Cream envelope. Certified mail sticker. The seal of the state of Georgia in the upper left corner. And below it, in small but entirely legible type, the office of the Attorney General. He said, "Chief Hargrove, please sign for receipt." Hargrove looked at the envelope, then at the marshal, then at the envelope again. He signed. Calvin Reeves thanked him and left. Hargrove sat at his desk for a moment. Just a moment, the length of a long breath, and then he opened the envelope. He read the first paragraph. He read it again. His face did not go red. It went the other direction entirely. It drained. It went the color of something that has had the light removed from it, the specific pallor of someone who has been certain for a very long time and is becoming, in real time, uncertain. His hand, when he set the letter down, was not steady. His lieutenant, who was passing in the hallway, and who had worked with Hargrove for 9 years and had never seen him look like that, stopped in the doorway. "Chief?" Hargrove said nothing. He picked up the letter again. "Read the second paragraph. Set it down." "Get me the city attorney," he said. His voice, for the first time in the lieutenant's memory, was not flat. It was thin, like something under too much pressure. "And close the door," Hargrove said. The door closed. 14 years. All of them. The press release went out at 10 o'clock, which was 17 minutes before Calvin Reeves arrived at the police department, which meant that the reporters covering the Caldwell beat learned about the investigation before Hargrove did. There were 4 of them, 2 from the regional paper, 1 from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who had been tracking use of force issues in smaller Georgia municipalities for a series she was writing, and 1 from a public radio station in Macon, who happened to be in Caldwell that day for an unrelated story, and who, when the press release appeared in her email at 10:03, changed her unrelated story immediately. The AJC reporter called Marcus Webb at 10:11. He answered on the second ring. She asked him how long he had been building this case. He said, "Since I understood what I was looking at, which was about 6 years ago, though you could argue it started 51 years before that, with a man in a spiral notebook. She asked him what he wanted the investigation to accomplish. He said, "I want it to accomplish what it says it will accomplish. I want 14 years of records examined. I want the pattern documented in a form that creates legal obligation. I want the 17 people who gave sworn statements to know that their names, which I am not permitted to disclose and which I will not disclose, did something real. I want the 43% of this town that has been policed differently than the other 57% to be able to walk to their car or their front porch or the community center on Calvary Street without doing the place calculation of what their presence costs them." She asked him if he thought Chief Hargrove would cooperate with the investigation. He said, "That's a decision he'll be making with his attorney. I'm not interested in speculating about Chief Hargrove's decisions." She printed every word. The story ran on the AJC website at 2 in the afternoon with the headline, "Georgia AG opens civil rights investigation into Caldwell Police Department after 6-year campaign by community organizer." By evening, it had been picked up by 11 news outlets. By the following morning, 43. The public radio piece aired that same evening, on the 6 o'clock broadcast. The reporter had driven to Calvary Street and recorded ambient sound in front of the community center, the traffic, the voices, the specific acoustic texture of that block, and she had used it as a bed under Marcus's voice, explaining what the center was and what the forum was and what had been built in those 1,200 square feet with the 2-pattern linoleum floor. It was 6 minutes and 40 seconds long, and it won a regional journalism award the following year, and the award citation described it as a portrait of what patient, documented, sustained civic engagement looks like in practice. 3 people who heard the broadcast on the radio that evening called the Caldwell Community Center the next morning to ask how they could help. The investigation took 11 months. What it found, documented, verified, legally established was this: use of force incidents in the 2 precincts bordering Calvary Street and the adjacent East Side neighborhood were occurring at a rate 4.3 times higher than in precincts serving predominantly white neighborhoods, controlling for call volume, time of day, and incident type. The disparity had been consistent for the entire 14-year period under review, with a trend toward intensification in the final 4 years. Of the complaints filed against Caldwell officers during the 14-year period, 88% had been closed without substantive investigation. In 16 cases, the complaint files contained documentation of the initial filing and nothing else. Not a single investigative step taken, not a single interview conducted, not a notation of why the case had been closed. The files were not lost. They were there. They simply had not been touched. In 4 cases, individuals who had filed complaints reported being contacted by officers subsequent to their filing, not to provide updates on the investigation, but in circumstances that, when examined in context, the state's investigators characterized in their report as consistent with patterns of intimidation. The report was 312 pages long. Marcus Webb read all of it. He read it in his back office at the community center, over 2 evenings, with a legal pad next to him on which he made notes in his small, precise handwriting. When he finished, he sat for a while with the legal pad in front of him. He had known most of it. He had suspected all of it. Seeing it in official language, in a document that carried the weight of the state, was different from knowing it. It was the difference between a conversation and a record. Both are real. Only one can walk into a federal courtroom. Hargrove resigned before the report was released. His resignation letter, 3 paragraphs long, cited a desire to spend time with his family and a belief that new leadership will best serve the department's future. He did not mention the investigation. He did not mention Calvary Street. He did not mention Marcus Webb. The city manager of Caldwell accepted the resignation in a statement that also did not mention any of these things, which was noted by everyone who read both documents. The city entered into a consent decree with the state that required, among other provisions, an independent civilian oversight board with subpoena power, mandatory body cameras with an independent custodial chain of evidence, a use of force policy written with input from community stakeholders and reviewed annually, a mandatory 40-hour community policing training curriculum, and a review process for all closed complaints going back 10 years. The city also agreed to a settlement with 3 of the 4 individuals whose complaint files showed evidence of intimidation. The settlement amounts were not disclosed. The city's insurance carrier, which paid the settlements, subsequently raised the city's annual premium by an amount that the Caldwell Courier described, in a story that ran on page 4, as significant. The Caldwell Police Department hired a new chief, a woman named Sergeant First Class Yvonne Trask, who came from a department in Savannah with a documented community policing record, and who, in her first week on the job, walked into the Calvary Street Community Center, introduced herself to Marcus Webb, and sat down at one of the mismatched chairs and said, "Tell me what I need to know." He told her for 2 hours. She came back the following week. She came back the week after that. Marcus Webb did not name anything after himself. This was notable because there were several opportunities to do so. The new Civilian Oversight Board invited him to chair it. He declined and instead nominated a retired schoolteacher named Helen Greer, who had filed one of the first complaints in Marcus's files, a complaint from 2009, 14 pages long, precisely documented, never once investigated, sitting in that cabinet for 14 years waiting to be seen. Helen accepted. The city council voted, the following year, to rename a stretch of East Side Boulevard 3 blocks, running from the corner of Calvary Street to the entrance of Caldwell Preparatory, the school where Marcus had taught for 11 years, the Amos Webb Corridor, after Marcus's grandfather. Marcus attended the dedication on a Tuesday morning in October. It was cool, the light, the particular gold of Georgia autumn, and there were maybe 60 people gathered at the corner of Calvary and the newly signed boulevard. He stood at the back, in his coat, with his hands in his pockets. Someone found him and asked him to say a few words. He walked to the front. He looked at the sign, Amos Webb Corridor, and he stood there for a moment, without saying anything. Then he said, "My grandfather kept a journal every day for 51 years. He wrote down what he saw. He wrote down what happened to people, and what was said, and what was done, and what wasn't done. He never published any of it. He never submitted it as evidence in anything. He just kept writing, in a spiral notebook from the drugstore, because he believed that bearing witness was not nothing, that paying attention was not neutral, that somewhere down the line, the record would matter to someone." He stopped. "It mattered," he said. He stepped back. 60 people on a Tuesday morning in October, in the gold light of Georgia autumn. That was all. If this story moved you, and I know it did, because you're still here, and that means something, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. Subscribe and hit the bell, because we are not done, and what comes next is worth staying for. And I want to ask you something before we move on. Have you ever kept a record that no one else knew about, documented something, held on to something, filed something away because you believed the day would come when it would matter? Tell me below, because those of us who keep the records deserve to know we're not alone. But here's what really gets me about this story, and I want you to sit with this. Hargrove went to Calvary Street that morning to tell Marcus Webb to stay in his lane. He drove there in his official vehicle, with 3 officers behind him, with 14 years of unchallenged authority under his feet, and he stood in a doorway and he said those words, "Stay in your lane." And what he did not know, could not have known, because he had never once believed that the record could actually arrive, was that 40 minutes later, a man in a dark blue sedan was going to park in front of his building and carry an envelope inside. He showed up to intimidate a man who was already done being intimidated. He arrived 40 minutes too late to matter. And that 40 minutes, those 40 minutes between the doorway and the envelope, were built from 6 years of Tuesday nights at the Forum, from 11 years of teaching, from spiral notebooks in a cedar chest, from a woman in Atlanta who said, "When you're ready," from 17 people whose names will never be in this story, but who gave sworn statements because they believed, against every historical precedent in their experience, that the record could matter. That's who builds the 40 minutes, not the chiefs, not the letterhead, the people who write things down when no one is watching, and keep writing, and keep filing, and keep showing up to the mismatched chairs on Calvary Street, because they know that somewhere down the line, the document walks into the room and says everything they couldn't get anyone to hear. So, here's what I want to ask you, and I want a real answer in the comments. What are you documenting right now that the room hasn't learned to take seriously yet? What are you writing down? What are you filing away? What are you carrying in a manila folder or a spiral notebook or somewhere inside you that you believe will matter, even if no one around you believes it yet? Tell me. Because Marcus Webb believed it for 6 years before the envelope arrived. And the envelope always arrives.